Okay, I'd like to turn our attention to some terminology now that we've talked about some of these blood gases. If there's an increase in carbon dioxide in the arterial blood, we call that hypercapnea. And if we have less carbon dioxide in the arterial blood, we call that hypocapnea. Low circulating O2 we call hypoxia, and there are a number of possible causes. Perhaps it could be anemic in the case of having low hemoglobin, circulatory, where too little oxygenated blood is delivered to the tissues. So if the blood pressure is to drop too low. Histotoxic, so an inability of the cells to use the available oxygen. So, for example, cyanide would inhibit cellular respiration. And hypoxia, where there's low arterial blood accompanied by inadequate hemoglobin saturation, which may occur at high altitudes. So if we talk about hypo and hypercapnia, the amount of CO2, one of the reasons why it's important is it will influence the acidity of the blood. So according to our bicarbonate buffering system equation, if there's too little carbon dioxide available, that would tend to reduce the amount of hydrogen ions, and you would be experiencing a relative alkaline blood. So if you were to hyperventilate under resting conditions, you'd be blowing off CO2 faster than your cells produce it. You would develop hypocapnia, and you'd also develop what's called respiratory alkalosis, where the body fluids become alkaline for respiratory causes. On the other hand, if you were to voluntarily hypoventilate and reduce ventilation, you would clear less carbon dioxide and CO2 in your blood would accumulate. You'd develop hypercapnia, and you may then develop what's called respiratory acidosis. Acidosis due to not blowing off enough CO2. You can see this in your textbook, and this is figure 13-28, where you can see here, if you are relatively hypoventilating, you would have elevated CO2, okay? And you would also have less oxygenation, and potentially causing hypoxia. And in this case, it would be hypoxic hypoxia due to relative hypoventilation. And on the other hand, if you were to hyperventilate, you'd be blowing off CO2 faster than your cells produce, and so your PCO2 would fall, and you would oxygenate a little bit more in the alveolar, and perhaps slightly increase arterial PO2. But if you recall, our hemoglobin is already over 98% saturated with oxygen at rest, so you will probably not oxygenate hemoglobin too much more. So these are our normal points, our normal arterial PO2 of about 100, and our normal alveolar and arterial PCO2 of around 46. The term hypo, and hyperventilation are often misinterpreted. Many students are aware that you increase respiration during exercise and would want to call that hyperventilation. After all, the ventilation is high. The problem is that during exercise, when we increase ventilation, we actually are ventilating an appropriate amount for our amount of metabolism. So we need a different term. Hyperventilation, strictly speaking, means that the pulmonary ventilation is in excess of your body's metabolic needs. The term we use for the increase in ventilation when it is matched with metabolism is hyperpnea. So that is what we usually observe in most exercise of low and moderate intensity, and even a little bit into the high intensity exercise domains. At high intensities, it may be necessary to increase ventilation a little further beyond metabolism and hyperventilate a little bit to help maintain acid-base balance. A brief summary of changes in variables related to respiration during exercise are listed in table 13-9. There's of course greater oxygen use. This is both at the cellular level and whole body level. This is matched with an increase in carbon dioxide production. These two and their ratio to one to the other changes a little bit with metabolism, where under resting conditions we tend to be using mostly fats, and so we have less CO2 production compared to oxygen use. And as we increase the intensity, we increase our reliance on carbohydrates, which proportionally increases CO2 production more than we increase oxygen consumption. Alveolar ventilation, we have a big increase, and that's increased by both increasing tidal volume and respiratory rate. At low and moderate intensity exercises, most of the increase in ventilation is due to increasing tidal volume, And beyond moderate intensities, most of the increase in ventilation is due to increasing respiratory rate. Remember, to increase alveolar ventilation, it is better to increase tidal volume than respiratory rate. Arterial PO2 is typically going to have a slight increase or stay the same, and PCO2 is typically going to stay normal or slight decrease. There are some very transient changes at the very onset of exercise, and then usually fairly well regulated. Oxygen delivery to muscles will be enhanced through increased muscle blood flow. The muscles will extract more oxygen. As their PO2 drops, more oxygen will be dropped off according to the oxygen dissociation curve, and so more oxygen will be available to serve as the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Because that oxygen use is coupled with the CO2 production at the cells, we also have a big increase in CO2 removal from the muscles. Now, with mild and moderate exercise, we maintain pH very well. But with high intensity exercise, as we increase reliance on anaerobic glycolysis and recruit motor units with a lot of glycolytic fibers, we might have a little bit of an increase in hydrogen ions that will need to be buffered. One of the principal causes of hypoxia, of course, would be going to high altitudes. Hyperoxia would be if you're breathing supplemental oxygen and have normal lungs. So at high altitudes, it's important to remember that the reduction in PO2 is related to the fact that there's a lower barometric pressure, but the percentage of air that's oxygen is the same. However, in the lab, you often might simulate high altitudes by lowering the percentage that's oxygen because it's harder to change the pressure inside of the lab. So once you get above about 10,000 feet, then that is when you would start observing the inspired PO2 falling beyond the steep portion of the oxygen dissociation curve. Across low altitudes, you don't observe too much of a reduction in our ability to oxygenate the hemoglobin because you're on the plateau region of the curve. So if you're at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet, you're still able to oxygenate fairly well. But beyond an altitude of about 10,000 feet is where you start observing arterial points that are on the steep portion of the curve.